Book 3, Chapter 11 of The Mermaid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mermaid by Lily Dougall. Chapter 11. The Riddle of Life. The schooner slowly moved along and lay not far from the steamship. The steamship did not start for Souris until the afternoon. Caius was put on shore there to await the hour of embarking. In his own mind he was questioning whether he would embark with the steamer or return to Cloud Island, but he naturally did not make this problem known to those around him. The skipper and several men of the schooner came ashore with Caius. There was a great bustle as soon as they reached the small wharf, because of what they had to tell. It was apparent from all that was told, and all the replies that were made, that no shadow of suspicion was to fall upon O'Shea. Why should it? He had, as it seemed, no personal grudge against Mermaid, whose death had been evidently an accident. A man who bore an office akin to that of magistrate for the islands came down from a house near the harbor, and the story was repeated to him. When Caius had listened to the evidence given before this official personage, hearing the tale again that he had already heard many times in a few minutes, and told what he himself had seen, he began to wonder how he could still harbor in his mind the belief in O'Shea's guilt. He found, too, that none of these people knew enough about Josephine to see any special interest attaching to the story, except the fact that her husband, returning from a long voyage, had been drowned almost within sight of her house. "Ah, poor lady," they said, and thus saying, and shaking their heads, they dispersed to eat their dinners. Caius procured the bundle of letters which had come for him by this first mail of the year. He sauntered along the beach, soon getting out of sight and hearing of the little community, who were not given to walking upon a beach that was not in this case a high road to any place. He was on the shingle of the bay, and he soon found a nook under the high black cliff where the sun beat down right warmly. He had not opened his letters. His mind did not yet admit of old interests. The days were not long past in which men who continued to be good husbands and fathers and staunch friends killed their enemies, when necessary, with a good conscience. Had O'Shea a good conscience now? Would he continue to be in all respects the man he had been, and the staunch friend of Josephine? In his heart Caius believed that Mermaid was murdered, but he had no evidence to prove it, nothing whatever but what O'Shea's wife had said to him that day she was hanging out her linen, and such talk occurs in many a household, and nothing comes of it. Now Josephine was free. What a blessing! He used the common idiom to himself, and then wondered at it. Could one man's crime be another man's blessing? He found himself, out of love for Josephine, wondering concerning the matter from the point of view of the religious theory of life. Perhaps this was heaven's way of answering Josephine's appeal and saving her, or perhaps human souls are so knit together that O'Shea, by the sin, had not blessed but hindered her from blessing. It was a weary round of questions, which Caius was not wise enough to answer. Another more practical question pressed. Did he dare to return now to Cloud Island, and watch over Josephine in the shock which she must sustain, and find out if she would discover the truth concerning O'Shea? After a good while he answered the question. No, he did not dare to return, knowing what he did and his own cowardly share in it. He could not face Josephine, and lonely as she was, she did not need him. She had her prayers, her angels, her heaven. Perhaps time, the proverbial healer of all wounds, would wash the sense of guilt from his soul, and then he could come back and speak to Josephine concerning this new freedom of hers. Then he remembered that some say that for the wound of guilt time no healing art. Could he find, then, other shrift? He did not know. He longed for it sorely because he longed to feel fit to return to Josephine. But, after all, what had he done of which he was ashamed? What was his guilt? Had he felt any emotion that it was not natural to feel? Had he done anything wrong? Again, he did not know. He sat with head bowed, and felt in dull misery that O'Shea was a better man than he, more useful and brave, and not more guilty. He opened his letters, and found that in his absence no worse mishap had occurred at home than that his father had been laid up some time with a bad leg, and that both father and mother had allowed themselves to worry and fret lest ill should have befallen their son. Caius embarked on the little steamship that afternoon, and the next noon found him at home. The person who met him on the threshold of his father's house was Jim Hogan. Jim grinned. "Since you've taken to charities abroad," he said, "I thought I'd begin at home." Jim's method of beginning at home was not in the literal sense of the proverb. It turned out that he had been neighboring to some purpose. Old Simpson could not move himself about indoors or attend to his work without, and Jim, who had not before this attached himself by regular employment, had by some freak of good nature given his services day by day until Caius should return, and had become an indispensable member of the household. "He's not a very respectable young man," said the mother apologetically to her son, while she was still wiping her tears of joy. "But it's just wonderful what patience he's had in his own larky way with your father, when, though I say it who shouldn't, your father's been as difficult to manage as a crying baby, and Jim, he just makes his jokes when anyone else would have been affronted, and there's father's laughing in spite of himself sometimes. So I don't know how it is, but we've just had him to stop on, for he's took to the farm wonderful." An hour after, when alone with his father, Simpson said to him, "Your mother, you know, was timorous at night when I couldn't help myself, and then she'd begin crying, as women will, saying as she knew you were dead, and that, anyway, it was lonesome without you. So when I saw that it comforted her a bit to have someone to cook for, I encouraged the fellow. I told him he'd nothing to look for from me, for his father is richer than I am nowadays, but he's just the sort to like vagary." Jim went home, and Caius began a simple round of home duties. His father needed much attendance. The farm servants needed direction. Caius soon found out, without being told, that neither in one capacity nor the other did he fulfill the old man's pleasure nearly so well as the rough-and-ready Jim. Even his mother hardly let a day pass without innocently alluding to some prank of Jim's that had amused her. She would have been very angry if anyone had told her that she did not find her son as good a companion. Caius did not tell her so, but he was perfectly aware of it. Caius had not been long at home when his cousin Mabel came to visit them. This time his mother made no sly remarks concerning Mabel's reason for timing her visit, because it seemed that Mabel had paid a long and comforting visit while he had been at the Magdalen Islands. Mabel did not treat Caius now with the unconscious flattery of blind admiration. Neither did she talk to him about Jim, but her silence whenever Jim's name was mentioned was eloquent. Caius summed all this up in his own mind. He and Jim had commenced life as lads together. The one had trodden the path of virtue and laudable ambition. The other had just amused himself, and that in many reprehensible ways. And now, when the ripe age of manlyhood was attained in that state of life to which, as the Catechism would have it, it had pleased God to call them, it was Jim who was the useful and honored man, not Caius. It was clear that all the months and years of his absence had enabled his parents to do very well without their son. They did not know it, but in all the smaller things that make up the most of life, his interests had ceased to be their interests. Caius had the courage to realize that even at home he was not much wanted. If, when Jim married Mabel, he would settle down with the old folks, they would be perfectly happy. On his return, Caius had learned that the post for which he had applied in the autumn had not been awarded to him. He knew that he must go as soon as possible to find out a good place in which to begin his professional life, but at present the state of his father's bad leg was so critical, and the medical skill of the neighborhood so poor, that he was forced to wait. All this time there was one main thought in his mind, to which all others were subordinate. He saw his situation quite clearly. He had no doubts about it. If Josephine would come to him and be his wife, he would be happy and prosperous. Josephine had the power to make him twice the man he was without her. It was not only that his happiness was bound up in her. It was not only that Josephine had money and could manage it well, although he was not at all above thinking of that. It was not even that she would help and encourage and console him as no one else would. There was that subtle something, more often the fruit of what is called friendship than of love, by which Josephine's presence increased all his strong faculties and subdued his faults. Caius knew this with the unerring knowledge of instinct. He tried to reason about it too. Even a dull king reigns well if he have but the wit to choose good ministers, and among men, each ruling his small kingdom, they are often the most successful who possess, not many talents, but the one talent of choosing well in friendship and in love. Ah, but it is one thing to choose and another to obtain. Caius still felt that he dared not seek Josephine. Since Lemaitre's death, something of the first blank horror of his own guilt had passed away, but still he knew that he was not innocent. Then, too, if he dared to woo her, what would be the result? That last admonition and warning that he had given her when she was about to leave the island with him clogged his hope when he sought to take courage. He knew that popular lore declared that, whether or not she acknowledged its righteousness, her woman's vanity would take arms against it. Caius had written to Josephine a letter of common friendliness upon the occasion of her husband's death, and had received in return a brief sedate note that might, indeed, have been written by the ancient lady whom the quaint Italian handwriting learned in the country convent had at first figured to his imagination. He knew from this letter that Josephine did not suppose that blame attached to O'Shea. She spoke of her husband's death as an accident. Caius knew that she had accepted it as a deliverance from God. It was this attitude of hers which made the whole circumstance appear to him the more solemn. So Caius waited through the lovely season in which summer hovers with warm, sunshiny wings over a land of flowers before she settles down upon it to abide. He was unhappy. A shade, whose name was Failure, lived with him day by day, and spoke to him concerning the future as well as the past. Debating much in his mind what he might do, fearing to make his plight worse by doing anything, he grew timid at the very thought of addressing Josephine. Happily, there is something more merciful to a man than his own self, something which of his hour of need assists him, and that often very bountifully. End of Book 3, Chapter 11. Book 3, Chapter 12 of The Mermaid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mermaid by Lily Dougall. Chapter 12. To Call a Spirit from the Vasty Deep. It was when the first wildflowers of the year had passed away, and the scarlet columbine and meadow rue waved lightly in the sunny glades of the woods, and all the world was green, the new and perfect green of June, that one afternoon Caius, at his father's door, met a visitor who was most rarely seen there. It was Farmer Day. He accosted Caius, perhaps a little sheepishly, but with an obvious desire to be civil, for he had a favor to ask which he evidently considered of greater magnitude than Caius did when he heard what it was. Day's wife was ill. The doctor of the locality had said more than once that she would not live many days, but she had gone on living some time, it appeared, since this had been first said. Day did not now call upon Caius as a medical man. His wife had taken a fancy to see him because of his remembered efforts to save her child. Day said apologetically that it was a woman's whim, but he would be obliged if Caius, at his convenience, would call upon her. It spoke much for the long peculiarity and dreariness of Day's domestic life that he evidently believed that this would be a disagreeable thing for Caius to do. Day went on to the village. Caius strolled off through the warm woods and across the hot cliffs to make this visit. The woman was not in bed. She was dying of consumption. The fever was flickering in her high-boned cheeks when she opened the door of the desolate farmhouse. She wore a brown calico gown. Her abundant black hair was not yet streaked with gray. Caius could not see that she looked much older than she had done upon the evening, years ago, when he had first had reason to observe her closely. He remembered what Josephine had told him, that time had stood still with her since that night. It seemed true in more senses than one. A light of satisfaction showed itself in her dark face when, after a moment's inspection, she realized who he was. "Come in," she said briefly. Caius went in, and had reason to regret, as well as on his own account as on hers, that she shut the door. To be out in the summer would have been longer life for her, and to have the summer shut out made him realize forcibly that he was alone in the desolate house with a woman whose madness gave her a weird seeming, which was almost equivalent to ghostliness. When one enters a house from which the public has long been excluded, and which is the abode of a person of deranged mind, it is perhaps natural to expect, although unconsciously, that the interior arrangements should be very strange. Instead of this, the house, gloomy and sparsely furnished as it was clean and in order. It lacked everything to make it pleasant, air, sunshine, and any cheerful token of comfort, but it was only in this dreary negation that it failed. There was no positive fault to be found, even with the atmosphere of the kitchen and bare lobby, through which he was conducted, and he discovered, to his surprise, that he was to be entertained in a small parlor, which had a round polished center table, on which lay the usual store of such things as are seen in such parlors all over the world, a Bible, a couple of albums, a woolen mat, and an ornament under a glass case. Caius sat down, holding his hat in his hand, with an odd feeling that he was acting a part in behaving as if the circumstances were at all ordinary. The woman also sat down, but not as if for ease. She drew one of the big cheap albums toward her, and began vigorously searching in it from the beginning, as if it were a book of strange characters in which she wished to find a particular passage. She fixed her eyes upon each small cheap photograph in turn, as if trying hard to remember who it represented, and whether it was or was not the one she wanted. Caius looked on amazed. At length, about the middle of the book, she came to a portrait at which she stopped, and with a look of cunning took out another which was hidden under it, and thrust it at Caius. "It's for you," she said. "It's mine, and I'm going to die, and it's you I'll give it to." She looked and spoke as if the proffered gift was a thing more precious than the rarest gem. Caius took it, and saw that it was a picture of a baby girl, about 3 years old. He had not the slightest doubt who the child was. He stood by the window and examined it long and eagerly. The sun, unaided by the deceptive shading of the more skilled photographer, had imprinted the little face clearly. Caius saw the curls, and the big sad eyes with their long lashes, and all the baby features and limbs, his memory aiding to make the portrait perfect. His eager look was for the purpose of discovering whether or not his imagination had played him false. But it was true what he thought. The little one was like Josephine. "I shall be glad to have it," he said, "very glad." "I had it taken at Montrose," said the poor mother, and, strange to say, she said it in a commonplace way, just as any woman might speak of procuring her child's likeness. "Day, he was angry. He said it was a waste of money. That's why I give it to you." A fierce cunning look flitted again across her face for a moment. "Don't let him see it," she whispered. "Day, he is a bad father. He don't care for the children or me. That's why I've put her in the water." She made this last statement concerning her husband and child with a nonchalant air, like one too much accustomed to the facts to be distressed at them. For a few minutes it seemed that she relapsed into a state of dullness, neither thought nor feeling stirring within her. Caius, supposing that she had nothing more to say, still watched her intently, because the evidence of disease were interesting to him. When he least expected it, she awoke again into eagerness. She put her elbows on the table and leaned towards him. "There's something I want you to do," she whispered. "I can't do it any more. I'm dying. Since I began dying, I can't get into the water to look for her. My baby is in the water, you know. I put her in. She isn't dead, but she's there, only I can't find her. Day told me that once you got into the water to look for her too, but you gave it up too easy, and no one else has ever so much as got in to help me find her." The last part of the speech was spoken in a dreary monotone. She stopped with a heartbroken sigh that expressed hopeless loneliness in this mad quest. "The baby is dead," he said gently. She answered him with eager, excited voice. "No, she isn't. That's where you're wrong. You put it on the stone that she was dead. When I came out of the asylum, I went to look at the stone, and I laughed. But I liked you to make the stone. That's why I like you, because nobody else put up a stone for her." Caius laid a cool hand on the feverish one she was now brandishing at him. "You are dying, you say?" pityingly. "It is better for you to think that your baby is dead, for when you die you will go to her." The woman laughed, not harshly, but happily. "She isn't dead. She came back to me once. She was grown a big girl and had a wedding ring on her hand. Who do you think she was married to? I thought perhaps it was you." The repetition of his old question came from her lips so suddenly that Caius dropped her hand and stepped back a pace. He felt his heart beating. Was it a good omen? There have been cases where a half-crazed brain has been known, by chance or otherwise, to foretell the future. The question that was now for the second time repeated to him seemed to his hope like an instance of this second sight, only half understood by the eye that saw it. "It was not your little daughter that came back, Mrs. Day. It was her cousin, who is very like her, and she came to help you when you were ill, and to be a daughter to you." She looked at him darkly, as if the saner powers of her mind were struggling to understand, but in a minute the monomania had again possession of her. "She had beautiful hair," she said. "I stroked it with my hand. It curled just as it used to. Do you think I don't know my own child? But she had grown quite big, and her ring was made of gold. I would like to see her again now before I die." Very wistfully she spoke of the beauty and kindness of the girl whose visit had cheered her. The poor crazed heart was full of longing for the one presence that could give her any comfort this side of death. I thought I'd never see her again. She fixed her dark eyes on Caius as she spoke. I was going to ask you, after I was dead and couldn't look for her any more, if you'd keep on looking for her in the sea till you found her. But I wish you'd go now and see if you couldn't fetch her before I die. Yes, I will go, answered Caius suddenly. The strong determination of his quick assent seemed to surprise even her, in whose mind there could be no rational cause for surprise. Do you mean it? Yes, I mean it. I will go, Mrs. Day. A moment more she paused, as if for time for full belief in his promise to dawn upon her, and then, instead of letting him go, she rose up quickly with mysterious looks and gestures. Her words were whispered. Come, then, and I'll show you the way. Come, you mustn't tell Day. Day doesn't know anything about it. She had led him back to the door of the house and gone out before him. Come, I'll show you the way. Hush, don't talk or someone might hear us. Walk close to the barn and no one will see. I never showed anyone before but her when she came to me wearing the gold ring. What are you so slow for? Come, I'll show you the way to look for her. Impelled by curiosity and the fear of increasing her excitement if he refused, Caius followed her down the side of the open yard in which he had once seen her stand in fierce quarrel with her husband. It had seemed a dreary place then, when the 3 children swung on the gate and neither the shadow of death nor madness hung over it. It seemed far more desolate now, in spite of the bright summer sunlight. The barns and stable, as they swiftly passed them, looked much neglected, and there was not about the whole farmstead another man or woman to be seen. As the mad woman went swiftly in front of him, Caius remembered, perhaps for the first time in all these years, that after her husband had struck her upon that night, she had gone up to the cowshed that was nearest the sea, and that afterwards he had met her at the door of the root house that was in the bank of the chine. It was thither she went now, opening the door of the cowshed and leading him through it to a door at the other end, and down a path to the cellar cut in the bank. The cellar had apparently been very little used. The path to it was well beaten, but Caius observed that it ran past the cellar down the chine to a landing where Day now kept a flat-bottomed boat. They stood on this path before the heavy door of the cellar. Rust had eaten into the iron latch and the padlock that secured it, but the woman produced a key and opened the ring of the lock and took him into a chamber about 12 feet square, in which props of decaying beams held up the earth of the walls and roof. The place was cold, smelling strongly of damp earth and decaying roots, but, so far, there was nothing remarkable to be seen. Just such a cellar was used on his father's farm to keep stores of potatoes and turnips in when the frost of winter made its way through all the wooden barns. In 3 corners remains of such root stores were lying. In the 4th, the corner behind the door, nearest the sea, some boards were laid on the floor, and on them flower pots containing stalks of withered plants and bulbs that had never sprouted. They're mine, she said. Day durstn't touch them. And saying this, she fell to work with eager feverishness, removing the pots and boards. When she had done so, it was revealed that the earth under the boards had broken through into another cellar or cave, in which some light could be seen. I always heard the sea when I was in this place, and one day I broke through this hole. The man that first had the farm made it, I suppose, to pitch his seaweed into from the shore. She let her long figure down through the hole easily enough, for there were places to set the feet on, and landed on a heap of earth and dried weed. When Caius had dropped down into the second chamber, he saw that it had evidently been used for just the purpose she had mentioned. The seaweed gathered from the beach after storms was in common use for enriching the fields, and someone in a past generation had apparently dug this cave in the soft rock and clay of the cliff. It was at a height above the sea line at which the seaweed could be conveniently pitched into it from a cart on the shore below. Some 3 or 4 feet of dry, rotten seaweed formed its carpet. The aperture towards the sea was almost entirely overgrown with such grass and weeds as grew on the bluff. It was evident that in the original cutting there had been an opening also sideways into the chine, which had caved in and been grown over. The cellar above had, no doubt, been made by someone who was not aware of the existence of this former place. To Caius, the secret chamber was enchanted ground. He stepped to its window, framed in waving grasses, and saw the high tide lapping just a little way below. It was into this place of safety that Josephine had crept when she had disappeared from his view before he could mount the cliff to see whither she went. She had often stood where he now stood, half afraid, half audacious, in that curious dress of hers, before she summoned up the courage to slip into the sea for daylight or moonlight wanderings. He turned round to hear the gaunt woman beside him again talking excitedly. Upon a bit of rusty iron that still held its place on the wall hung what he had taken to be a heap of sacking. She took this down now and displayed it with a cunning look. "I made it myself," she said. "It holds one up wonderful in the water. But now I've been a-dying so long, the buoys have burst." Caius pityingly took the garment from her. Her mad grief, and another woman's madcap pleasure, made it a sacred thing. His extreme curiosity found satisfaction in discovering that the coarse foundation was covered with a curious broidery of such small floats as might, with untiring industry, be collected in a farmhouse. Corks and small pieces of wood with holes bored through them were fastened at regular intervals, not without some attempt at pattern, and between them the bladders of small animals, prepared as fishermen prepare them for their nets. Larger specimens of the same kind were concealed inside the neck of the huge sack, but on the outside everything was comparatively small, and it seemed as if the hands that had worked it so elaborately had been directed by a brain in which familiarity with patchwork and other homely forms of the sewing woman's art had been confused with an adequate idea of the rough use for which the garment was needed. Some knowledge of the skill with which fishermen prepare their floats had also evidently been hers, for the whole outside of the garment was smeared or painted with a brownish substance that had preserved it to a wonderful extent from the ravages of moisture and salt. It was torn now, or rather, it seemed that it had been cut from top to bottom, but besides this one great rent, it was in a rotten condition, ready to fall to pieces, and, as the dying woman had said, many of the air-blown floats had burst. Caius was wondering whether the occasion on which this curious bathing dress had been torn was that in which he, by pursuing Josephine, had forced her to cease pushing herself about in shallow water and take to more ordinary swimming. He looked around and saw the one other implement which had been necessary to complete the strange outfit. It, too, was a thing of ordinary appearance and use, a long pole or poker, with a handle at one end and a small flat bar at the other, a thing used for arranging the fire in the deep brick ovens that were still in use in the older farmsteads. It was about 6 feet long. The woman, seeing his attention directed to it, took it eagerly and showed how it might be used, drawing him with her to the aperture over the shore, and pointing out eagerly the landmarks by which she knew how far the shallow water extended at certain times of the tide. Her topographical knowledge of all the sea's bed within about a mile of the high-water mark was extraordinarily minute, and Caius listened to the information she poured upon him, only now beginning to realize that she expected him to wear the dress, and take the iron pole, and slip from the old cellar into the tide when it rose high enough, and from thence bring back the girl with the soft curls and the golden ring. It was one of those moments in which laughter and tears meet, but there was a glamour of such strange fantasy over the scene that Caius felt, not so much its humor or its pathos, as its fairy-like unreality, and that which gave him the sense of unreality was that to his companion it was intensely real. "You said you would go." Some perception of his hesitation must have come to her. Her words were strong with insistence and wistful with reproach. "You said you would go and fetch her in to me before I die." Then Caius put back the dress she held on the rusty peg where it had hung for so long. "I am a man," he said. "I can swim without life-preservers. I will go and try to bring the girl back to you, but not now, not from here. It will take me a week to go and come, for I know that she lives far away in the middle of the deep gulf. Come back to the house and take care of yourself, so that you may live until she comes. You may trust me. I will certainly bring her to you if she's alive and if she can come." With these promises and protestations, he prevailed upon the poor woman to return with him to her lonely home. Caius had not got far on his road home when he met Day coming from the village. Caius was full of his determination to go for Josephine by the next trip of the small steamer. His excuse was valid. He could paint the interview from which he had just come so that Josephine would be moved by it, would welcome his interference, and come again to nurse her uncle's wife. Thus thinking, he had hurried along, but when he met Day, his knight-errantry received a check. "Your wife ought not to be alone," he said to Day. "No, that's true," the farmer replied drearily, "but it isn't everybody she'll have in the house with her." "Your son and daughter are too far away to be sent for?" "Yes," briefly. "They are in the West." Caius paused a moment, thinking next to introduce the subject which had set all his pulses bounding. Because it was momentous to him, he hesitated, and while he hesitated the other spoke. "There is one relation I've got, the daughter of a brother of mine who died up by the Gaspé Basin. She's on the Magdalens now. I understood that you had had dealings with her." "Yes, I was just about to suggest. I was going to say. I wrote to her. She is coming," said Day. End of Book 3, Chapter 12. Book 3, Chapter 13 of The Mermaid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mermaid by Lily Dougall, Chapter 13. The Evening and the Morning. Josephine had come. All night and all the next day she had been by her aunt's bedside, for Day's wife lay helpless now, and death was very near. This much Caius knew, having kept himself informed by communication with the village doctor, and 24 hours after Josephine's arrival he walked over to the Day farm, hoping that, as the cool of the evening might relax the strain in the sick room, she would be able to speak to him for a few minutes. When he got to the dreary house he met its owner, who had just finished his evening work. The two men sat on wooden chairs outside the door and watched the dusk gathering on the sea and land, and although they did not talk much, each felt glad of the other's companionship. It was 9 years since Caius had first made up his mind that Day was a monster of brutality and wickedness. Now he could not think himself back into that state of mind that could have formed such a judgment. When Caius had condemned Day, he had been a religious youth who thought well of himself. Now his old religious habits and beliefs had dropped off, but he did not think well of himself or harshly of his neighbor. In those days he had felt sufficient for life. Now all his feeling was summed up in the desire that was scarcely a hope, that some heavenly power, holy and strong, would come to his aid. It is when the whole good of life hangs in a trembling balance that people become like children, and feel the need of the motherly powers of heaven. Caius sat with Day for 2 hours, and Josephine did not come down to speak to him. He was glad to know that Day's evening passed the more easily because he sat there with him. He was glad of that when he was glad of nothing that concerned himself. Day and Caius did not talk about death or sorrow, or anything like that. All the remarks that they interchanged turned upon the horses Day was rearing and their pastures. Day told that he had found the grass on the little island rich. "I remember finding 2 of your colts there one day when I explored it. It was 4 years ago," said Caius dreamily. Day took no interest in this lapse of time. "It's an untidy bit of land," he said, "and I can't clear it. 'Tisn't mine, but no one heeds the colts grazing." "Do you swim them across?" asked Caius, half in polite interest, half because his memory was wandering upon the water. "They got so sharp at swimming, I had to raise the fence on the top of the cliff," said Day. The evening wore away. In the morning Caius, smitten with the fever of hope and fear, rose up at dawn, and, as in a former time he had been wont to do, ran to the seashore by the nearest path, and walked beside the edge of the waves. He turned, as he had always done, towards the little island and the Day farm. How well he knew every outward curve and indentation of the soft red shelving bank. How well he knew the coloring of the cool scene in the rising day, the iridescent light upon the lapping waves, the glistening of the jasper red of the damp beach, and the earthen pinks of the upper cliffs. The sea-birds with low pathetic note called out to him concerning their memories of the first dawn in which he had walked there searching for the body of a dead baby. Then the cool tints of dawn passed into the golden sunrise, and the birds went on calling to him concerning the many times in which he had trodden this path as a lover whose mistress had seemed so strange a denizen of this same wide sea. Caius did not think with scorn now of this old puzzle and bewilderment, but remembered it fondly, and went and sat beneath baby Day's epitaph, on the very rock from which he had first seen Josephine. It was very early in the morning. The sun had risen bright and warm. At that season even this desolate bit of shore wag garlanded above with the most lovely green. The little island was green as an emerald. Caius did not intend to keep his present place long. The rocky point where the red cliff ended hid any portion of the Day farm from his view, and as soon as the morning was far enough advanced he intended to go and see how the owner and his household had fared during the night. In the meantime he waited, and while he waited, fate came to him smiling. Once or twice as he sat he heard the sound of horses' feet passing on the cliff above him. He knew that Day's horses were there, for they were pastured alternately upon the cliff and upon the richer herbage of the little island. He supposed by the sounds that they were catching one of them for use on the farm. The sounds went further away, for he did not hear the tread of hoofs again. He had forgotten them. His face had dropped upon his hands. He was looking at nothing, except that, beneath the screen of his fingers, he could see the red pebbles at his feet. Something very like a prayer was in his heart. It had no form. It was not a thing of which his intellect could take cognizance. Just then he heard a cry of fear and a sound as of something dashing into the water. The sounds came from behind the rocky point. Caius knew the voice that cried, and he rose up wildly, but staggered, baffled by his old difficulty, that the path thither lay only through deep water or round above the cliff. Then he saw a horse swimming round the red rocks, and on its back a woman sat, not at ease, evidently distressed and frightened by the course the animal was taking. To Caius the situation became clear. Josephine had thought to refresh herself after her night's vigil by taking an early ride, and the young half-broke horse, finding himself at large, was making for the delicacies which he knew were to be found on the island pasture. Josephine did not know why her steed had put out to sea, or whither he was going. She turned round, and, seeing Caius, held out her hand, imploring his aid. Caius thanked heaven at that moment. It was true that Josephine had kept her seat upon the horse perfectly, and it was true that, unless the animal intended to lie down and roll when he got into the deep grass of the island, he had probably no malicious intention in going there. That did not matter. Josephine was terrified by finding herself in the sea, and she had cried to him for aid. A quick run, a short swim, and Caius waded up on the island sands. The colt had a much longer distance to swim, and Caius waited to lay his hand on the bridle. For a minute or two there was a chase among the shallow, rippling waves, but a horse sinking in heavy sand is not hard to catch. Josephine sat passive, having enough to do, perhaps, merely to keep her seat. When at length Caius stood on the island grass with the bridle in his hand, she slipped down without a word and stood beside him. Caius let the dripping animal go, and he went, plunging with delight among the flowering weeds and bushes. Caius himself was dripping also, but, then, he could answer for his own movements that he would not come too near the lady. Josephine no longer wore her loose black working dress. This morning she was clad in an old habit of green cloth. It was faded with weather and too long in the skirt for the fashion then in vogue, but Caius did not know that. He only saw that the lower part of the skirt was wet, and that, as she stood at her own graceful height upon the grass, the wet cloth twisted about her feet and lay beside them in a rounded fold, so that she looked just now more like the pictures of the fabled sea maids than she had ever done when she had floated in the water. The first thing Josephine did was to look up in his face and laugh. It was her own merry peal of low laughter that reminded him always of a child laughing, not more for fun than for mere happiness. It bridged for him all the sad anxieties and weary hours that had passed since he had heard her laugh before. And, furthermore, he knew, without another moment's doubt, that Josephine, knowing him as she did, would never have looked up to him like that unless she loved him. It was not that she was thinking of love just then. That was not what was in her face. But it was clear that she was conscious of no shadow of difference between them such as would have been there if his love had been doomed to disappointment. She looked to him to join in her laughter with perfect comradeship. "Why did the horse come here?" asked Josephine. Caius explained the motives of the colt as far as he understood them, and she told how she had persuaded her uncle to let her ride it, and all that she had thought and felt when it had run away with her down the chine and into the water. It was not at all what he could have believed beforehand, that when he met Josephine they would talk with perfect contentment of the affairs of the passing hour, and yet so it was. With graver faces they talked of the dying woman, with whom Josephine had passed the night. It was not a case in which death was sad. It was life, not death, that was sad for the wandering brain. But Josephine could tell how in those last nights the poor mother had found peace in the presence of her supposed child. "She curls my hair round her thin fingers and seems so happy," said Josephine. She did not say that the thin hands had fingered her wedding ring, but Caius thought of it, and that brought him back the remembrance of something that had to be said that must be said then, or every moment would become a sin of weak delay. "I want to tell you," he began. "I know I must tell you. I don't know exactly why, but I must. I am sorry to say anything to remind you, to distress you, but I hated Lemaitre. Looking back, it seemed to me that the only reason I did not kill him was that I was too much of a coward." Josephine looked off upon the sea. The wearied, pained look that she used to wear when the people were ill about her, or that she had worn when she heard Lemaitre was returning, came back to her face, so that she seemed not at all the girl who had been laughing with him a minute before, but a saint, whose image he could have worshipped. And yet he saw then, more clearly than he had ever seen, that the charm, the perfect consistency of her character, lay in the fact that the childlike joy was never far off from the woman's strength and patience, and that a womanly heart always underlay the merriest laughter. They stood silent for a long time. It is in silence that God's creation grows. At length Josephine spoke slowly. "Yes, we are often very, very wicked. But I think when we are so much ashamed that we have to tell about it, I think it means that we will never do it again." "I am not good enough to love you," said Caius brokenly. "Ah, do not say that!" She turned her face away from him. "Remember the last time you spoke to me upon the end of the dune." Caius went back to the shore to get the boat that lay at the foot of the chine. The colt was allowed to enjoy his paradise of island flowers in peace. End of Book 3, Chapter 13. End of The Mermaid by Lily Dougall.